Alright, in this video we're going to look at simplifying fractions. So make sure you put the date up in the upper right hand corner. So let's look at a fraction. Remember, a fraction is just something that compares two numbers. In the top, we have a numerator, and in the bottom, we have the denominator. These are the pieces or the parts of a fraction that you should be aware of. And just a note, all numbers that can be written as fractions are called rational numbers. Alright, so one of the areas we're going to look at with fractions is writing them in simplest form. So to write something in simplest form for a fraction, it means that what we're going to do is we're going to reduce a fraction by dividing. So let's take a look at an example. Then we'll look at a visual, and then we'll see how it works. So let's take a look at the fraction 3/6. So if I make a circle, and I cut this up into 3/6. Three-sixths is half of that circle. So if you think about it, when I'm reducing this fraction, I can divide both of these numbers by 3, which gives me 1/2. So if I look at a circle again, and I shaded in 1/2 of the circle, what you should see is that these are the same, so they're called equivalent fractions. When you're simplifying a fraction, you're just turning it into a simpler version of itself. So 3/6 is 1/2. They're the same thing. That's what simplifying or reducing a fraction means. So you look for a common factor, the greatest common factor between both numbers that you could divide both numbers by without getting a decimal. So 3 is the highest number I can divide each of these numbers by in the numerator and denominator to get a simplified fraction. Let's try another example. Say I gave you 8/20. So again, we're looking at simplifying this or reducing it by making it by dividing. So we're looking for a number that I can divide both 8 and 20 by. So one quick tip is that even numbers can always be divided by 2. So I could divide this by 2 since both of these numbers are even. So 8 divided by 2 is 4, and then 20 divided by 2 is 10. But if you notice, I have 2 more even numbers that I can keep dividing these by. So I could divide them by 2 again. And that would give me 2/5. So once I get to this point, I can't reduce that any further because I can't divide 2 and 5 by a common number. You might have noticed with 8/20 that you could have done it in one step if I had divided each of these by 4. So if you had divided each of these by 4, you would have gotten 8 divided by 4 is 2, and 20 divided by 4 is 5. So you would have gotten the same answer, you would have done it a little bit quicker. Let's look at another example. Let's say I gave you the fraction 6/18. So for 6/18, you want to look at what are the factors of 6 and what are the factors of 18. So I'm going to divide each of these by 6 because that is the greatest common factor that each number can be divided by. And so when you divide 6 by 6, you get 1, and 18 divided by 6 is 3. So 1/3. So 6/18 is the same thing as 1/3. If you wanted to, you could have divided these by 2 again, since they're both even. So let's divide both of these by 2 so you see that example. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 18 divided by 2 is 9. But then now you would have to divide each of these again by 3, because they can each be divided by 3. So 3/9 gives me 1/3. So again, I get the same answer, I just have to do a little bit more work. So when you're doing these problems, the easiest way to do them is to use it's called a factor sheet, and you look for each number and see the factors of those numbers. When you find the greatest common factor, that's the number you can divide each of them by. All right, one more example. It's 36 divided by 45. So this one you might not know the factors right away, so you're going to use the factor sheet that was given to you. Find 36 and find 45 and see what's the biggest number they have in common. So you might see that they have 1 in common, but that's not going to be enough to divide or reduce. So I have to find a bigger number that they each have in common. So the biggest number they each have in common would be 9. So that means I could divide 36 by 9 and 45 by 9. So 36 divided by 9 is 4, and 45 divided by 9 is 5. You might have been able to do 3, because you could divide each of these by 3, but that's also going to take a little bit more work in the end. So here we can do it in one quick step. So when you're reducing fractions, you're looking for the biggest factor that you could divide each number in the fraction by. And what it does is it gives you an equivalent fraction. So that's simplifying fractions. You're definitely going to want to have that sheet to help you when you're simplifying fractions.